Ladies and gentlemen, the tragic demise of 26-year-old Anna Sebastian, working at Ernst Young, has triggered a massive debate over how corporate India is dealing with work/overwork. But it seems cases like those of Anna are the exception rather than the rule, because a Pune EY office has apparently been operating since 2007 without a state permit which regulates work hours. Maharashtra's Additional Labour Commissioner, Shailendra Pol, has claimed that EY has been operating without a mandatory registration under the state's Shop and Establishments Act, which caps the maximum working hours for adults at 9 hours each day and 48 hours each week. Now, this has got us thinking. Are even 48 hours a week too much for Indians? Keep in mind that the global average work week ranges around 35 hours a week, which is around 7 hours a weekday. That's the schedule followed by the United States, the UK, EU, and Japan. In contrast, the average Indian work week is 46.7 hours. Just by the way, Bhutan works harder than us at 52%. It's little wonder that most of us feel overworked, stressed, and we feel like we are dealing with a burnout. Ladies and gentlemen, a UKG survey has shown that 78% of Indian employees are dealing with burnout, with 64% employees even ready to accept a pay cut if it means a reduction in workload. But there is another question. Are hours the best way to judge productivity? We no longer live in the industrial age of the 20th century, where employment meant working at factories on shifts. Chances are your work is gauged in the form of projects and results, not in terms of how many hours you spend on the job. In terms of hybrid working, shouldn't labor laws also be revised to be in sync with the times? My guest this evening, Lloyd Mathias, is a business executive joining us on the broadcast. Priya Chetty Rajgopal is the managing partner at Multiversal Advisory. Shailesh Gandhi is a former CIC joining us on the broadcast. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us. Lloyd Mathias, I just want to start by accepting that for many of us, a 9-hour workday doesn't exist. It simply does not exist. Is it time for everyone to just accept that and move on? That it is how it is. We live in a developing country. There are 20 people who are willing to do double the work that you do, who are waiting to be hired as soon as you step down or fired. And India is not the US or Europe. There are no boundaries. Your bosses will call you on the weekend. You are expected to take calls post-work hours. Is it time that we just accept these realities? Because it is how it is.
Thanks, Shreya. I think that's certainly not how we need to move forward. I think what happened to the young lady in Pune, very sad. But I think the way forward is moving on and course correcting. I think the time for the blame game is up. And I think really what we really need to look at is how can India, in corporate India, course correct. And I think there are some clear areas. So clearly accepting the fact that because we are a highly competitive society, and there's always going to be a dearth of good quality jobs and lots of people chasing it.
Talent
does not mean we need to exploit employees in the organization. I think what needs to be done is to accept the fact that mental health issues are real, that different people have different coping mechanisms. But for somebody, an 8-hour day could seem stressful, and somebody would be pretty happy working for 10, 11, or 12 hours. But I think the acceptance to recognize that people are different and a much higher level of empathy is definitely required. What I would think of is one is clearly need to prioritize well-being of employees. That's where people spend the most amount of their time outside of home. I think there's a certain need to support new hires. I think people who are new into the workforce, they need a little bit of hand-holding, right? They're moving from a very different atmosphere. And invariably, and unfortunately, in a lot of organizations, they are the ones who are loaded with the most amount of work. They say work trickles down, and it's the interns and the younger people in the organization that get exploited the most. I think third is also the need for employees, for supervisors, for managers to actually understand and tackle issues like burnout. They need to recognize that employees need free time, they need off time, they need to get some amount of free time in their very, very stressful days. And I think lastly, foster open communication. What I do see, and specifically in this case, but even in general,
Lloyd,
is that there aren't enough opportunities for younger employees who feel stressed, who feel loaded, who feel at times,
okay.
actually go out and speak, whether it's to HR or to somebody within the organization. And I think very often that's where things start to snap and go out of control.
Okay. Lord, we'll try and fix your audio. It's not very clear. But Priya Chetty, come in here. You know, it's often said if you can't take the heat, just get out of the kitchen. Now, there are many people who've come back with the argument that the Prime Minister of this country is working 14, 16 hours a day. You know, secretaries in the government of India are late at work till 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night. Your armed forces are working round the clock. Your doctors are putting in 15, 16 hours of duty. When that happens, you don't call it a violation of labor law. You don't call it exploitation. And if, you know, a young chartered accountant is expected to take calls on a weekend or work on the weekend, you're calling this exploitation. Do you see that point? Do they have a point there?
Every argument has a point. You can understand both sides when people talk about something as sensitive as this. You have an older generation and people like me, for example, who have worked for over 35 years, who have worked very hard and never really thought too much about it. I don't know whether that's good or bad, and I certainly don't want to comment about that. Having said that, you also have these, if you look at people on doing manual labor, or, people who are working on the roads, you look at the armed forces, the doctors, that all the cohorts that you mentioned, there are an expectation of long hours, and I think if one can just sort of step back a bit, there's also that issue of saying it's all right as long as it's somebody else, but this is what I would like. And Lloyd has put a point very clearly that, all basically not all five fingers are the same in your hand. I mean, there are different strokes for different folks. Some people can do, some people can't do. And, you just have to be able to recognize that and work with it. But it's a tough call. Where do you draw the line between having a strong work ethic, a result orientation, a sense of discipline, with also a sense of respect for the person's personhood, the focus on one's own humanity, the fact that the person is a person outside of work, and has increasingly now, as we know, with our greater transparency and acceptance of mental health issues, sometimes we can be on the brink. So how do we deal with all of that? I don't think it's an easy answer for corporate India. I don't think it's an easy answer for young India. And I certainly don't think we can solve this overnight without going back several steps. But the going forward, I've mentioned this again, is looking at new ways of partnering at work where you can still actualize, you can still leverage, great talent, but you're also deeply conscious of certain frameworks in terms of, either having a good buddy system or having checks and balances of mental health. These things are very important.
Okay. Okay, Priya, so what you're telling me is that one of the critical mistakes that organizations, corporates, managers make is they don't tend to look at people as people who have a life outside work as well. That they are people with families, that they are people with, social and personal commitments, that they are people outside work as well who have a full life outside work. That somehow gets missed. But Shailesh Gandhi, the fact is, and I'm just going to come back to my original question about whether we should just accept that a 9-hour workday simply doesn't exist anymore in India. It used to be 8 hours a day in the good old days, I remember. Then it became 9 hours a day. Now the Karnataka government at one point had proposed a 14-hour workday for IT professionals if it was required. The Tamil Nadu government had wanted a 12-hour workday. They wanted to tweak the Factories Act. It didn't happen. But is it just time for us to make peace with the fact that you will have to work harder than the Europeans and the Americans?
First and foremost, it's very sad that this young girl has committed suicide, one empathizes with the family. Having said that, this also throws up one other thing. Adherence to laws is extremely poor and nobody bothers. I'm shocked at the fact that Ernst Young and organizations
Shailesh,
of international
Mr. Gandhi, I just want to correct you here. The young lady Anna hasn't committed suicide. I just want you to know that.
My apologies. My apologies. But the adherence to laws is very poor. As your TV is showing, there is no license for the unit in Pune. This shows how little we care for laws. Secondly, I am looking at it from a broader perspective. Today, providing livelihoods to young people is the top priority of this country. In that, I would feel that restricting the labor hours would be a far more sensible thing to do rather than extending it. Because roughly, it means you could employ 20% or 30% more people. And that should be the focus of the country and the nation. Labor laws must be followed, and providing employment to more people should be the focus rather than making people work more and more.
Okay, I just want to bring in Lloyd Mathias in. Lloyd Mathias, as I conclude this argument, one of the strains in the, a segue argument in the entire case also has been how there are different standards that corporates employ for their employees in India and for those who work in, say, in Australia, or those who work in the US, or those who work in Europe. How do you view that debate that is going on social media?
Shreya, I hear you. I think there are a set of laws that all companies have to comply that are specific to a nation. Every country has their own set of laws. And like in this specific instance, you have the Shop and Establishments Act, about which an allegation has been made that the specific company did not have permission. But then there are a set of global HR policies that should be uniformly applied. I think there is clearly no case for having less stringent norms in India than, let's say, for a more Western world. Right? I think there has to be a broad equalization, because finally you're dealing with humans, and to be humane in your approach, to be empathetic, I think that's absolutely important, whether it's a large global multinational or whether it's a homegrown company. I think that's kind of table stakes. So there is certainly no case for discrimination on having different. Having said which, I think there is a certain level of customization that will be required. I think you have to recognize within societies there are certain norms. There is a concern that in India, organizations tend to exploit employees or push them harder, right? And specifically getting people to work on weekends, working long hours, specifically junior employees who are not able to actually assert themselves given the fact that they're very new to the workplace, and also the fact that we are a highly competitive work environment. I think that's where a lot of soul searching needs to be done. And I don't believe legislating will just solve the problem. I do know the government is specifically getting into this case. I think a lot of it is required deep soul searching from corporate India. How can they get about looking at promoting work-life balance? How can they make leadership more accountable? How can they foster open communication between various management levels? And lastly, tackle issues like burnout. It is real. And tragically, companies don't do enough to handle it. Just a simple case is that the whistleblower policy that exists in all companies is totally oriented towards financial misappropriation or sexual harassment, right? So we have clear norms on POSH, we have clear norms on financial irrigation. But how often are people permitted or encouraged to whistleblow about a toxic work atmosphere, about being exploited or bullied in the workplace? And I think that aspect that corporate India needs to look at, and that's what needs to be addressed in all of war footing.
Also, I think, managers from a certain generation need to realize that the young children who come to them at the age of 23, 24, 25, 26, this is an entirely different generation. Their thought process is different. Their work ethic is different. And don't expect them to be like you, because you work 20 hours a day doesn't mean you expect them to work 20 hours a day. They have different priorities. This is also a conversation, I think, where different generations just don't seem to be understanding what the other is saying. But the good thing is that all of us are talking about India's work culture, toxic or not. We'll leave it there for the moment. Lloyd Mathias, thank you very much for joining us. Priya Chetty, thank you. And Shailesh Gandhi, thank you very much for joining us.